going to introduce her to you anyway. She's only been here at the Guild for, what, 130 or 140 years? Okay, all right. And done everything in the Guild possible. So she's going to talk to us about traditional Indonesian batiks, and she's going to tell you a little bit about how they're made and used and how she learned to incorporate them into quilts. She was born and raised in the suburbs of Sydney, Australia, and in 1963 she married Frank Ashman, a U.S. Foreign Service State Department employee. And they spent the next 26 years living in 7 different countries and raising 3 daughters, and we've gotten to meet one of her beautiful daughters. In 1978, Frank was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia, where Pat learned to quilt and became acquainted with the local batiks. When Frank retired in 1989, they settled in Pennsylvania, and then in 1992, they relocated to Florida. Pat joined Racing Fingers Quilt Guild and has served as president twice, program chair, and secretary, before settling into the position of second vice president for membership, and she will never be allowed to leave. Okay? Well, that's part of the membership of the newsletter. So without further ado, please welcome Pat, our very, very treasured quilt member.
Hi. Okay, I'm going to start out. I hope I don't bore you to death first, but I thought it might be fun to just tell you how I came to see my first quilt. Okay. Let's go back to 1976, the bicentennial. Remember? Anybody remember the bicentennial? Okay, there's a few of us around. Okay. Frank was assigned to the American Consulate General in Frankfurt, Germany. And I will tell you at that time, and it probably still is, the largest Consulate General in all the American agencies. And it had just about every American government agency represented there by at least 1 or 2 people, up to God knows how many. Anyway, there was also a very large military presence, because at that time the Berlin Wall still existed. And so there was a lot of military people also in Frankfurt. And just to give you some idea, the Department of Defense ran 2 elementary schools, a junior high and a high school. The elementary school that my children attended had 1,600 children. 1,200 went home for lunch every day. Imagine what that was like when they all came back. Fortunately, they did something about it. Anyway, I'm just giving you a little background to tell you that the only sewing that I ever did was children's clothes. And I had kind of hoped that this would be up on television, but I'm going to send this around. The photos are faded because they've been in a photo album that did not have acid-free paper. And you can take a look at them.
Who are these people?
They are my 3 daughters, aged at that time.
And you made all the outfits?
9 down to, well, would have been from 9 down to 4. I have 3 children in 5 years. Anyway, moving on. As I said, it was the bicentennial, and you can see the outfits are bicentennial outfits. But I'd just like to digress, and if you don't mind, I hope you would appreciate this little story. There was a wonderful man who was actually the school's audiologist, and he liked to organize activities for the kids, so he organized Halloween costumes, which had to be related in some way to the bicentennial, hence those 3 outfits for me. But my favorite costume will always be the little boy in one of the grades, and they had the competition within the grades, and this little boy came as George Washington's tooth. And some of these people are amazing. the parents had constructed this huge paper mache tooth and stuck it on top of this kid. Anyway, just to sort of give you some idea of the stuff that went on. As I said, it was a pretty large contingent at the embassy, at the Consul General. We lived in a very large apartment complex, and we had our own preschool and kindergarten. And of course, like anything like that, we had fundraisers. And, you know, it's usually just the usual bake sale and so on. But in 1976, the wife of the Consul General, who happened to be German originally, made a quilt. And she donated it for a raffle. Ring a bell? Anyway, this quilt went over very well. Actually, it was very simple. It was a wall hanging, and it was a log cabin done in brown. Now, I have to tell you that the bicentennial it is sort of pretty well known for creating a tremendous revival in quilting. I mean, people were always quilting, but it was sort of low-key. But the bicentennial, people just went nuts. And I guess she'd taken a class and she made this quilt, and it went over very well. But for me, I walked in and this quilt was hanging on the wall, and it was the first quilt I had ever seen. I'd never seen a quilt before. Bedspreads, yes, but I had never seen a handmade quilt. That was my first experience, okay. It went over so well that the following year, 1977, some bright spark decided that we were going to do it again. Anyway, I had to turn around. Sorry about that. Okay. The decision was made that they would make a cathedral windows quilt. And the reason for that, of course, was you don't have to quilt a cathedral windows quilt. For anybody who's not familiar, that's what it looks like. You want to talk about that? So, my sewing skills being somewhat limited, someone approached me and said, we're going to make this quilt for a raffle. Would you like to help? And I thought, okay, I guess I can. Anyway, somebody had brought back a lot of muslin, cut it up, and we were given the instructions on how to hand sew the box and asked would we donate our own fabric for the windows. And so I made my piece, and I think about it now, I have to laugh because there was muslin, but all the windows were blends. I mean, that's all you could get at the time, and it's the 70s, for God's sakes. Everything was polyester. Anyway, so the end result was beautiful. But as I was making it, I was thinking to myself, you know, this is kind of neat. I think I might try and make something like this one of these days. Okay, 1978 arrived, and we learned that we were going to go to Indonesia. And I had been in, we'd had 2 tours prior to that in Thailand, Bangkok, and I thought, okay, I'm probably going to have a maid, and maybe I need something to, you know, as a kind of a hobby. So I decided to learned macrame. It's the 70s, folks, okay? So I bought books, I bought the materials, and I bought myself macrame. Actually, I got pretty good at it. I actually made a handbag. So we finally get to Jakarta in August 1978. And of course, there's the usual business. You have to get in, they give you housing, you have to get settled, you have to get your housing effects out of customs, you have to get your kids in school, you know, you got all this stuff. Anyway, we finally get that sorted out, and I thought, well, I'm pretty certain, based on everywhere I had ever been, that there was going to be some kind of a women's organization there. And sure enough, there was the American Women's Association of Indonesia. And so I found out about that, I joined, and I learned that they had programs every month with speakers, with programs, with speakers. But in October, they would always have a craft show. And it was a show that featured all the different crafts that all these different women did. Now I have to point out at this point that Jakarta at this time had a huge expatriate community. To give you some idea, the international school that my children attended from kindergarten through 12th grade had 39 different nationalities. So it was varied, and the majority of expatriates, especially English-speaking ones, sent their children to that school, but actually the Japanese community was so large, they actually had their own school. There was every possible nationality you could imagine, but of course the Americans, they're always the biggest. But it wasn't necessarily because of the embassy. Oil. There's oil rigs. Still got a lot of oil rigs, and a lot of these oil rigs were staffed by Americans. They're out in the ocean, out in the water, and they went out for 2 months, came back for a month. Well, of course, all this personnel creates something called dependence. Okay. And so all these dependent wives had to find something to do, because about the only job you could get was teacher at these international schools, maybe a nurse, but otherwise you couldn't work. You're not going to be able to work for the Indonesians. So, and then there were a couple of people that worked at the embassy. So what do? They have hobbies. As someone said to me, you can only do so much shopping. So I heard about this craft show, and I said, well, I'm macrame, could I work on the macrame booth? And she said, oh yes, we've already got somebody organising that, but yeah, by all means, join us. And so I thought, okay. Well, the day dawned, and we actually went in the day before and helped set up with the booth and so on. So the day dawned, and there were something like 30-odd crafts around this room. I was very impressed at all these different crafts. But the queen of the show, dead center on the stage, was the quilt group. And right there, hanging right in the center of the stage, was this magnificent cathedral windows quilt, where every window was huge, and every window was a different batik. And I thought, wow, that is something. And I think I'm going to find out more about this. So I found out that there was a group of about 35 to 40 women who met once a week at the home of, actually, I'll tell you, she was a dependent. Her husband was working with the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And she had learned to quilt back in the States, and she was basically had set up this quilt group. So I went out to find out what I could. Now, I need 2 people to hold a quilt up, down to the meat. I just wanted you to hear all that because I wanted you to understand how I got into this.
Can you get on the stage?
Really, someone taller really should do it because... Sorry.
Identifies
Really, what I really need is Kim. Okay, most of you have probably seen this quilt already. This is my very first quilt. Okay, now I'm going to tell you how I came to make this quilt, but what I would like to do beforehand is give you just a taste of what I learned about the batiks and how they were made that went into it. Now I'm going to relieve them of this. I think if what we can do is just drape the quilt over this table. Okay. When I told one of my daughters, the one that most of you met, that I was going to do this program at some point, of course, the first thing she did was go on the internet. Now I have to emphasize over and over again, we're talking about the late 70s, early 80s, no internet, right? Anyway, Wikipedia had something to say about this, and I thought it was pretty interesting because it's actually fairly recent. In October 2009, UNESCO officially recognized the batik tulis, which is an item they use, and the batik chop, as a masterpiece of oral and intangible heritage of humanity from Indonesia, and encouraged the Indonesian people and the Indonesian government to safeguard, transmit, promote, and develop the craftsmanship of batik. Since then, Indonesia celebrates the National Batik Day on October 2nd. Nowadays, Indonesians wear batik in honor of this ancient tradition. And at the same year, UNESCO also recognized what boils down to is that they expect the Indonesian students to learn aspects of making batik, so that obviously they don't want it to be a dying craft, although I don't think it will be. Indonesian batiks like this have been made in Indonesia for hundreds of years. What I learned was that an actual batik is only 2 meters long and about 42 inches wide, because that's how the original fabric comes. They get their fabric probably from India. And sometimes you get one that's 3 meters, but most of the time they come as 2 meter pieces. And the reason for that, primarily, is that they wear them. It's a sarong, and there's a very special way that they wear them. And you could have like a low-end batik, but there's classes of batik. And as you get more and more intricate and more detailed, they obviously become more expensive, and that means the upper class people wear those. So it's, class system, I guess. But I can tell you, my maid wore a batik every day. I never saw her in regular clothes. She wore the batik sarong with a long sleeve top. I'm going to show you once again. You won't see it too much, but I'm going to pass it around. That little girl that you see in that bicentennial outfit, which I hope comes back to me at some point, this is the same girl. She was 9 there, she's 14 here. And I talked to her the other day. This is my eldest daughter. And I said, Denise, do you remember why you were in this outfit? And she said, oh, there was we had neighbors, all American neighbors, but this was a woman who was married to one of the Americans. She was Indonesian. She's a real character. And for some reason, we think that there was some kind of a fancy dress thing going on. And she spotted Denise and decided that she would work in this outfit. And so this gives you an idea of what they look like. A little delicate, but you can look at them later. This gives you an idea of how they were worn. An American friend of mine, a woman who was very petite, very slim, told me that she was going to a function where she was required to wear, I guess you would call it, formal Indonesian outfits. And the way they wrapped the sarong around them, I think what they're trying to do is emphasize the rear end, because she said it was so tight and she had these pleats at the front, which she said it was like walking in a whole skirt. She could hardly walk. And of course being tiny didn't help any. Anyway, okay, we've got this batik that is 2 meters. When I was taken to a factory to watch it being made, I saw this man and he was using something they call a chop. These are chops. They're made from copper. They're very intricate. It's a craft that is passed down through families. I don't know if they're heavy. These are ornamental. I have a whole collection of them, but I'm not going to bring them all because they're all so heavy. But this one, if you dip this in wax and then put it on the fabric and then dyed that fabric, you would end up with a white crab. So obviously, if you wanted a brown crab, you would have to have a negative. And they do. But all these chops, they last for a very long time because they're copper, and they are very intricately made. I don't know if you want to have a look at them a little more closely. Be careful. Oh no, they're, like I said, they're ornamental. They're made for that purpose. They're made, you know, to be like trivets, or I've got them hanging on the wall.
Did you use actual chops and make boutiques while you were there?
Never. Not the way I saw them being made, no. No, I was taken to a factory and I watched this man use a chop to work on a piece of batik, and he dipped it in the wax and very carefully laid it on the fabric. And he dipped it in the wax again and lined it up and laid it on the fabric. Incredibly, I mean, he had to do that for, well, a 2 meter piece of fabric, 42 inches wide. Very, very labor intensive. And then when they've put that initial wax, it has to be, they dye the lightest color, and then they wash the wax off, keep the wax because it's precious. Then they get another chop and go through that whole procedure again, wash the wax, dye it the next dark color, wash the wax off, take another chop, go through the whole thing again, and dye it another color. That's how it's done, or that's how it was done. I'm going to say a little bit about, the other story is, like I said, that uses a chop. There is another instrument they use called, it's spelled Canting, but I believe it's pronounced chanting. Their C's are always pronounced as a ch. Anyway, the chanting, to me, is something like a miniature Aladdin's lamp. You know, well, can you picture what I'm saying? You know, with the handle and the little container and the tube. And we were taken to another factory, and there was a room almost as big, long as this one, and there were all these women sitting at a piece of fabric about this wide and almost as long as the room. And I found out it was silk, and that it was eventually going to be a very expensive, I imagine, Japanese kimono. And flowers and leaves had been drawn on it, and these women were painting it. So they have this chanting, and they have it on a burner, and they keep the wax liquid all the time, and then they paint around the outline with wax, and then with paint, pick up a paintbrush and paint the fabric. And then pick up the chanting, and they have to blow on it. It's sort of more hot, and they sort of blow to cool it just a little, and then they pour on the wax again, and more painting. Extremely labor intensive. Labor is cheap, so it was then. So I'm just going to go on a little bit briefly about in Bali batiks. In 1980, Bali batiks, as we know them, didn't exist. I have a feeling there are some very, very talented people, artists, on Bali who were making magnificent wall hangings, paintings, using the batik method. And I think Mr. Hoffman and some other enterprising people found these people and they thought, let's see what we can do to use all this talent. And so I have a feeling that was how Bali batiks came about. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this came about. I went out to this quilt group and I said, I'd like to make a quilt, and I sat and listened to these people, and a lot of them actually were quite experienced. No surprise, they were missionaries, a lot of Baptist missionaries there at the time. And they said, well, I said, the reason I picked this pattern was because the woman who was in charge of this group, her name is Cheryl, had made this quilt. And I, along with just about everybody else who was brand new to this, thought that was what we had to do. This was the quilt we had to make, okay? So I said, okay, how do I do this? And they said, well, you have to get into a group. Okay, how do I get into a group? Well, a group consisted of anywhere from 8 to 16 women. And in my case, I opted for the smaller pieces. It cost me $8, or the equivalent of $8. And what would happen was we would contribute this money, and a couple of women would go to various batik shops, and in this case, this was considered to be a brown group. You'll see there's all different shades of brown there. And they buy about 30 batiks. And as I just told you, they're 2 meters, and they would tear them, and you, in my case, got a 16th. Well, of course, I later found out that's really a fat 1/8, but I didn't know that for like 20 years. Anyway, so I had these 30 fat 1/8s, and then out of that, I was supposed to try and make these diamonds. And sometimes, as it was pointed out to me, you don't worry about grain. What's important is that you try to match, at least have 2 pieces that match each other. So it was fussy cutting, except I didn't know it was called fussy cutting then. And of course, we did not have rotary cutters, we did not have rotary mats. It was all done with plastic templates, see-through templates, a number 2 pencil, and scissors. And you had to make those number 2 pencil lines match. And that was how these Lemoyne styles, because I didn't know it was Lemoyne style at the time. But anyway, after I had made several of these, I took them out to Cheryl and I said, if I do this, okay? And she said, you know, this is really considered intermediate quilting. I don't know how you tell me. Anyway, I put this, okay, then the other thing was, all right, where did these little squares come from, right? Okay. Okay. They're cocktail napkins. Okay. In case you're interested, I'll show you in a minute. So what happened, I found out, I said, okay, yeah, I'm making these blocks, so, oh, and this background fabric, muslin was totally, but you just couldn't buy muslin. Your muslin, we had to have it sent in, mail in, or brought in. This is a fabric called Tetalon. It's a polyester fabric, and it's going to outlive everybody, unless they set it on fire. Because I tell you, that's the strongest fabric you're ever going to come across, and it's very popular in the East. And I don't know why, because it's hot. But anyway, I said to someone, you know, how do I get this? She said, well, I'll take you to a quilt shop and I'll show you. And the way they came was, it's a 3-meter piece of fabric, and each meter holds 9 of these. 12 inches is 30 centimeters, approximately. So they had these 30 centimeter cocktail napkins on a black background, and so 27, you get 27 of these squares. And they're big enough that you could cut 12.5 inches, and, you know, number 2 pencil, scissors, and then you attach them. Now, I did machine these blocks together, and the border, but the quilting is done by hand. Now, let me tell you something else that happened that we used to do at this gathering. Sometimes someone would come in with a completed quilt top, and she would want help basting it. And we had these rather primitive quilt frames. They were 2x4s, or were they 2x2s, I don't know, pieces of wood, long pieces of wood, and we nailed very strong fabric to them, canvas. And then we, somebody knew someone, a guy who would make stands, quilt stands, and we would put these 2x2s in the quilt stands and hold them together with a C-clamp. And that was our quilt frame. And so they would set up this quilt frame, because the rooms were very large, and we had terrazzo tile floors. That's important. And so they'd lay out the batting, lay out the top, and there'd be, 10 of us helping to base the quilt. And we basted it with thread. And the way they did it was they would have 2 or 3 people underneath sliding around on these terrazzo tiles. And I was one of them and so they'd stick the needle down, you grab it, push it up. Stick the needle down, really excited there. Yeah, down the needle comes up, and that's how we basted the quilts. So I eventually got I got this top together in 6 months. It took me 8 years to quilt it. But anyway, I got it basted with some help, and I started working on it. But in the meantime, I thought, okay, while I thought I could probably only do this during the daytime, and I thought, okay, well, what else can I do? Well, then I'd learned that really these fat eighths were not really large enough to, there just wasn't enough fabric to fool around with. So I went in for a double droop, and then you get fat quarters. The fat quarter of a 2-meter batik is pretty big. It's quite a sizable piece. And I thought, all right, what am I going to do? Well, Cheryl, once again, our leader, had started making a quilt called Around the Twist. And it looked pretty neat, and it didn't seem to use a lot of pieces because I was terrified of anything that had more than 10, 12 pieces in it. So I started to make it around a twist. And this is as far as I got before I realized that this was never going to work. But I kept it. I got this far. You don't have to photograph this. One of the reasons I'd like you to see this, I'd like you to see how bright the colors are, because there's a reason, okay? Anyway, I didn't like, this is blue tetraron. I didn't like it. I could see the way I had put it together was not going to work, so I thought, okay, forget that. So, at the same time, I had bought a double group of what we call multicolored batiks. Oh, and by the way, you will learn that different parts of Java, Indonesia, Jakarta is on the island of Java, which is where these batiks are made. Different areas are sort of famous for different types of the way they make batiks. Anyway, so I had this multicolored group, and I thought, and I got these 30 pieces of fabric, and I looked at it, and I thought, what the heck am I going to do with that? And, well, I went out for inspiration to this group, and it just so happened that a woman walked in, and she'd had, I think it was a brown group, and she said that she had decided that the only thing she could do with it was make grandmother's fans, because each piece would be the same, and you wouldn't have to make a decision about how you were going to match different pieces together. So, oh, but by the way, this was supposed to be a brown and blue group, by the way. So this is my grandmother's fan quilt. Well, no, it's up, it's sideways. It's on the corner. We're still off. We're still off. It's a, here, it's a month.
Watch that water, you guys.
That's my grandmother's fan quilt. Thank you.
You do need to smile for this one. Come on. Here we go. Perfect.
That because the pieces are so large, I was able to get 2 sets of fans out of every fat quarter. And so you could see that some of them kind of match and some don't. You sort of find yourself thinking, oh, I think, gee, were they from the same piece of fabric? For example, this one is the same as that one.
Beautiful.
That one came from the same piece of fabric as that one there. And you can see that some of the others, yes, you could see, oh yeah, I could see they came from the same piece, but there's others and you're thinking, really, they came from the same piece of fabric. But it was just a matter of how to fussy cut it. So, anyway,
It's still that beige, that wasn't muslin yet though, was it?
this is muslin.
Oh.
Yeah, by this time I had started subscribing to Quilter's Newsletter magazine, which back in 1970 through the 80s was a wonderful, wonderful magazine. It was one of the best educations I'd ever had, and it taught me so much. Anyway, I decided that I just kept making these fans, and I decided the person who had made these, had given me the inspiration to make fans, had put them on his side. But I thought, no, I think I want them to look like fans, so I want them on point. The only thing is, I didn't know, I think I could have just kept making fans indefinitely. But what happened around the 80s, I might add, by this time we had left Jakarta and we're in Mexico City, and then we went on to Frankfurt. Oh, I'm going to digress. I think I need to go back and tell you about the finishing of this one. We're in Frankfurt, Germany, and I've been working on this thing for 8 years, and we were getting ready to leave, and I thought, I got to get this finished. And so I bought a hoop. I'd had it on this big frame, and I thought, this isn't going to work. I got a hoop, and I sat down, and I just quilted it, and I just got it finished and bound, and that was it. It was done. So, but in the meantime, I was making these fans, and I thought, okay, how many of these things do I need? Well, you know, no internet. I thought, well, I know how to calculate, you know, 12-inch blocks, sashing, whatever, but I don't know how to calculate on point. Well, Bonnie Lehman, who's the editor of Quilters News magazine and a wonderful innovative quilter called Judy Martin, wrote a book called Taking the Math Out of Making Patchwork Quilts. And it came out in 1981. And thank God, because I said, I would have just kept making fans. Anyway, it told me how many I needed to make, and I thought, I've got to stop. I've got to stop, and I've got to get on with this. So, someone had told me that to do this, you applique the fan to a muslin block. So that makes sense. They also told me that when you applique a curve, and I didn't know anything about applique, you snip in the seam allowance, right? And rod. I didn't just snip, I hacked. I cut these out of it. Anyway, I proceeded to applique these fans to these blocks. I blocked them off, and I started, and I actually believe I pieced them together, and I was in the process of going to actually try to start to quilt the quilt when I looked at these blocks and I thought, that applique, if you could call it that, would never survive. And I re-appliqued every single block. And I'm glad I did, because it held up to being laundered. Anyway, by this time we were in Ottawa, Canada, and I had one teenage daughter still living with me, and we're in a house that had a very large finished basement. So I was able to set up my quilt frame, which I had traveled with me, these 2x2s and these quilt stands and seat clamps, and I set it up, and I said to my daughter, okay, and you bring a friend, you are going to help me base this quilt. And they did. I was on the top with the needles going down, and I gave them a couple of cushions, and they slid up and down underneath that quilt, and they were the bobbins. They did. They hopped. And then I proceeded to quilt it using a hoop, and it took me 2 years to quilt this
How did
quilt.
you mark it?
I'm sorry.
What did you use for marking?
Number 2 pencil. Yep. And there's a couple of books out called The Finishing Touch, and It's Not a Quilt Until It's Quilted, and that's where I got the patterns from. Because it's not a continuous thing. I mean, when you hand quilt, you've got a little bit more flexibility about moving around. Okay, so while that was proceeding, I have to tell you, through all this, I made a lot of other quilt tops. Most of them I turned into tied comforters for my daughters, but when I got to the Ottawa Valley, when I got to Ottawa, I joined the Ottawa Valley Quilters Guild, which had at that time about 300 odd members. And I was really getting into quilting, and not just hand quilting. I was learning a little bit more about machine quilting and machine piecing. Because at this point, of course, we had rotary cutters, and we had rulers, and we had rotary mats. It was wonderful. I died and got to heaven when I got my first rotary cutter. Anyway, I was trying to decide whether I should just proceed. And I decided, okay, I'll get on with this other one. I went back to, where it is, I went back to the one that I had abandoned, the Around the Twist. And yeah, I decided I'd go back to this. And I proceeded to make and finish Around the Twist. Now by this time, as I said, I've become a very big fan of Quilters Newsletter magazine. As I said, they taught me a lot about setting and how to make it look a little bit more attractive, and I realized that the way to do it for me was to have the lighter ones in the center radiating out to the dark. And this is my Around the Twist. And it's faded. It was on a bed for a long time, and the blues of the blue dyes of the 70s didn't always hold up very well. So you could see it's not quite as bright as it was originally. I got it onto a frame. This quilt, I got a little bit better with my hand quilting. This one took a year. And that is the end of that. Now, just to finish up, the reason I've given, this is the third time I have given this talk. I varied it a little bit. Thank you for your patience. But what inspired the first one was an article that was in Quilters Newsletter magazine back in 2002. And it's called The Batik Tradition on Java. And this one is called Batiks Past and Present. It's sort of like a combination of two articles. And I looked at that and I thought, I think I could give a little talk about this, which I did. And then I repeated it again several years later, and now this, okay? So I have made 30, there's 36 people in this room, maybe some should share, but there's 30 copies of this. It's a really, really good article. It tells you a great deal more than I could ever possibly tell you, okay? So,
when you said you marked with the number 2 pencil, how did you get rid of the number 2, the markings then?
it washed out.
Okay.
I have the same question. Yeah, I'm thinking, did she mark it on the back, or how did that work? Just mark? Go ahead.
To be honest, the quilting took a lot of it out. The number 2 pencil is not that, you know, it's not that difficult, it's not that dark. So, you know, you put the stencil, the picture underneath it, the picture of the and trace it, and yeah, it quilted out. And then of course I always wash my quilts, so yeah, it washed out.
All right.
I was getting a little tired towards the end, but there is one last thing I would like to say about this final quilt. As the name is Around the Twist, I called it Around the Bend because that's where you went when you were trying to put it together. I'll give you an idea. If you're trying to use different kinds of fabric, Okay, how, I'm looking at it now and trying to identify a 12-inch block. Okay, that, for example, that is a 12-inch block. And when you look at it, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's like 8 different fabrics in a 12-inch block. And you've got to figure out which one you're going to do next. Drives you nuts. Anyway.
I would have been over the bend. All right.